next, we are going to take a look at our involvement in the Spanish-American War. All right. So this war is nicknamed by Theodore Roosevelt, no less, as the Splendid Little War. Okay. It's a very short little war as far as wars go. It's less than a year long, and it takes place, obviously, between Spain and America, and it is over a couple different islands, but specifically it is over Cuba. So let me give you just a little bit of background on what was going on in this particular conflict. So we're going to kind of see how we got involved in the Spanish-American War. I want you to think about how valid these causes were. We'll go more in depth into this in class. The individuals who gained fame through this, what we got through our involvement in the war, and what we lost. Okay, so that's what we're going to focus on today. So we're going to start by actually talking about a revolution. So Cuba is controlled by Spain. It is a Spanish colony. It has been for a long time. And a lot of people in Cuba are not happy with Spanish rule, particularly a guy named Jose Marti. So Jose Marti leads a revolution in 1895 against Spanish rule, and it's a relatively short revolution, but it's not a relatively pretty one. The people of Cuba, the native Cubans, they're fighting a guerrilla warfare, so they are basically, it's kind of deal like burning homes and property and this sort of thing. But what you need to understand is that, much like Hawaii, there were American businessmen in Cuba. We own sugar plantations as well in Cuba. So a lot of the property that is being destroyed by the rebels is American property. Okay, so think about how Americans are going to feel about that. Another thing that happens in this conflict is something called reconcentration camps. So think about what that word might sound familiar to you as. Think about like World War II with concentration camps. It's basically the same idea where the Spanish, in order to kind of control the Cuban population, would round up a lot of the native Cubans, and they were put into these camps, and they were given very little food and water. They were all kind of smushed in together. Disease was pretty rampant. There was a lot of starvation. They were super terrible conditions. And this was basically very similar to what the Nazis were doing in World War II. And this word kind of got out, right? Like people saw photographs and stories of these concentration camps. They're like, whoa! Civil rights issue, right? And a lot of people really got on Spain for this. So there are two camps in America. There are the American businessmen, and there are the average Americans who are hearing about the stories of this revolution. The American businessmen are opposed to the revolution. As you can imagine, it's threatening their income. Their property's being destroyed. They're losing crop, right? They're going to lose money. However, a lot of other Americans are supporting the revolution. They kind of see it as following the same ideals as the American Revolution, overthrowing a tyrannical government. They hear stories about the concentration camps, and they don't want things like this to continue, right? So you've got two basic groups of people in the United States when this revolution is going on. So this is kind of one of the first causes, really. This is the background for where we're going to get involved in the Spanish-American War. It's also important to understand that there are a lot of reporters that come from America to Cuba in order to report on this revolution and what's going on, and that's how a lot of that is getting back to the States. So the next slide has just got a couple photographs here. So this photograph down at the bottom are some Cuban men in one of the reconcentration camps, and you can see, I mean, when we're talking about horrible conditions, we mean horrible conditions. The picture up there at the top is a lot of the skeletons of people who died in these reconcentration camps, and just look at the pile of these bones, guys. Like, huge numbers of people died, and this is really something that's going to anger a lot of the Americans at this time. So this political cartoon I think is pretty interesting. If you look at the political cartoon, it's trying to encourage Americans to get involved in this conflict. So if you look down at the left, this represents Cuba, and you can see that Cuba has been chained up by Spain. It says the 16th century methods. You think about like the Inquisition and medieval torture, basically, is what they're accusing the Spanish of. You can see at the top it says the Spain's motto, words like barbarity, cruelty, murder, and who's reaching out trying to save Cuba? Liberty, right? So the idea is that the Cuban Revolution is about liberty. But look who else is so close, right? Cuba and America are this close. They're only 90 miles from each other. But what's Uncle Sam doing? He's blinded, right? And what's he blinded by? American business interest. So this political cartoon is really showing you that businessmen are holding America back, while liberty is what's trying to liberate Cuba, right? And so, again, trying to get Americans involved in this conflict here. So while this is going on, okay, like I said, there are a group of journalists down in Cuba, and as the revolution is kind of winding down, right, there's a lot of reports coming back and it's like, oh, you know, things are kind of good now, like, you know, it's pretty chill, it's pretty good, but that's not going to sell newspapers, right? So this is something called yellow journalism, and just a really famous quote. It may be apocryphal, which means this guy may have never said this, but William Randolph Hearst was the owner of a major newspaper in New York City, and supposedly when he got a telegram saying that, you know, things have calmed down now, things are pretty chill in Cuba, he replies, I'll tell you what, you just furnish the pictures and I'll provide the war. In other words, saying, like, if you can give me a photograph, I can make up a story that goes back with that photograph. And this is called yellow journalism. And it's called this because it was based on a cartoon where the main character of the cartoon was named the Yellow Kid. So William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, two of the major leaders of the New York Journal and the New York World, the two biggest newspapers in New York City. And basically they're going back and forth at each other, trying to sell newspapers. And whoever can come up with the best headlines and sell the best story is going to sell the most newspapers. So they use something known as sensationalism. So basically this is an idea that emphasizes sensationalism over fact. So emphasizes small details that you exaggerate. Sensationalism is an exaggeration, right? So it's this idea that we want to sell newspapers, so if we have to lie, if we have to make up stuff, if we have to, you know, manipulate the story in any way that we can, that's what we're going to do. And if you really think about it, a lot of news stations do this today. This is not old, right? This is new. This is not something that's gone away. It's something that's still here. So this is a really, like, sensational idea, especially because most Americans are only getting their news from this source. They don't have any other sources to check it out, so they have to rely on the newspapers and hope what is being reported is fact. So like I mentioned, these are the two guys I mentioned earlier, Hearst and Pulitzer. Both own these two major newspaper companies, the New York Journal and the New York World, and it's all about trying to sell the most newspapers. If you think about it, if you've ever seen the movie Newsies, there's a clip in that movie where the kids are basically saying, you know, make up a story, because that's how you're going to sell the papers. So, like, saying that there's a, like, extra, flood in New York City, when really there was just, like, a little leak at somebody's house, right? That's yellow journalism, and that's what these guys are trying to do. And so they're basically trying to make America get involved in what's going on in Cuba. Okay, so yellow journalism is the first cause that we have here. This is just a great example of American yellow journalism. So read the headline. It says, Spaniards search women on American steamers. That's an American ship. So you've got this woman, and what have they done? They have stripped her naked. Shocking, right? So they're not just searching women, they're stripping them down and, like, you know, feeling them up, and oh my God, can you imagine, right? Like, how terrible for these women. And if you'll notice, this is not a photograph, right? This is a drawing. Maybe these guys are not actually stripping down American women. Maybe they're just, like, looking through their luggage, right? But this is the sensationalism, right? And imagine if you were a woman in 1895 and you saw this in the paper, you would be shocked. Like, how dare they, right? You might think that, what if they tried to do this to me? I can't even imagine. And so this is that idea. They're trying to get Americans more involved. The next thing that happens is a letter called the Jablome Letter. So the Jablome Letter was written by a guy named Enrique Dupe de Leon. He was the Spanish minister to the United States. And he writes this letter that's critical of William McKinley. Remember, McKinley's president. And here's the thing about this letter, right? He basically criticizes McKinley's job as president, what he's doing. Now, it's okay for Americans to criticize their president, but it is not okay for foreign governments to criticize the president, right? Like, you can say all the trash you want about William McKinley as an American, but as soon as somebody from Spain does it, well, oh, no, like, I don't think so. You can't say that about my president, right? So this letter is leaked to the press, and the press have a field day with this, right? Like, can you believe this guy's supposed to represent Spain in the United States, and what is he saying? He's talking about how terrible McKinley is. Are we going to let this stand, right? So this is where a lot of the jingoists come in. So remember, jingoism is people who are trying to fight for American imperialism, and a lot of the people that read this letter wanted to get back at Spain, because they were like, we cannot put up with this crap. So this is an excerpt from the letter, and you can see it's in this third paragraph down here, where it says, besides the natural and inevitable coarseness with which he repeats all that the press and the public opinion of Spain has said of Wheeler, it shows once more what McKinley is, weak and catering to the rabble, and besides, a low politician who desires to leave a door open to me and to stand well with the jingoes of his party, right? Catering to the rabble, well, that's the American people. He's insulting us too, and he's a low politician. He's weak. You can't say this about our president. So it really increases the fervor of the jingoes in America. So remember, the jingoes or jingoism. Right. The last major cause that we have here of the Spanish-American War is the explosion of the USS Maine. So the USS Maine was a ship that had been sent to Cuba during the Revolution to protect the American interests there. So protect the businesses, the property owned by Americans, protect any Americans that might be there. Basically, it's just kind of the Navy floating off the coast to say, like, hey, we got your back, right? Well, wouldn't you know, an explosion happens. The ship sinks. 250 sailors are killed on this ship, and it is a major tragedy. When the papers get a hold of this, they are blaming Spain. They basically say Spanish spies boarded the Maine and set explosives. Now imagine, think about like September 11th, right? Just after September 11th happened and we found out who had done it, all of America was wanting to get at them, right? This is the same kind of thing, because the Americans were told, the American population was told that Spain had blown up not just American citizens, American Navy men, right? People in the military. This was a huge catastrophe, and Americans were furious, right? They wanted to get at Spain, and this is going to be the deciding factor that allows Americans to declare war on Spain. What's interesting to find is that research over the years have been done to prove that it was not Spain that it blew up the Maine. It was probably like some misfiring on the ship in the engine room or something. Terrible tragedy, a terrible accident, but definitely not Spain. So these are the three major causes of this war. Yellow journalism, so the press basically telling Americans what they want to hear. A letter written by a guy who said, our president is weak. And the explosion of a ship blamed on a country who didn't actually have any involvement in it. Not terribly great reasons to get involved in a war, right? However, that's exactly what happens. So we actually fight this war on two different fronts. The first front that we fight it on is the Philippines. So the Philippines are a series of islands that are owned by Spain, okay? They're like in Indonesia, so just south of Japan. And there was actually a revolt in the Philippines as well. They had revolted against Spain, and a guy named Emilio Aguinaldo was the leader of that revolt. And the United States kind of wanted to edge its way into the Philippines at that point. We kind of saw that the Philippines would be another great stopping point for us. So the Pacific Fleet heads to the Philippines in case a war happens, right? So in case we declare war on Spain, which all this stuff had kind of been building up to, we want to have some people there just in case. So we can fight the Spanish on that front as well. They were led by a guy named Commodore George Dewey, and he fights a pretty major battle in which he destroys the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay. And this is going to be where the first surrender of the war takes place, where the Spanish troops surrender to the Americans, not the Filipinos. Remember, this began as a revolt in the Philippines, but they're not surrendering to the Filipino men, right? They're surrendering to the American troops. It's going to be part of the American treaty, okay? kind of keep that in mind because the result of that is going to be pretty important. The other part of the war is the war in the Caribbean. So this is the war in Cuba, right? So the American fleet, basically their job is to blockade Havana. Havana is the capital of Cuba, and if we can blockade them, it keeps troops and supplies from getting in and out, and allows us to basically take more control over the island. Now, one particular man really kind of became famous in this war, and that man is Theodore Roosevelt. So Theodore Roosevelt at the beginning of the war was William McKinley's Secretary of the Navy, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, not even the top secretary. But when this war broke out, he decided that he wanted to join up and fight in the war. So he resigned his post and joins forms a unit of cavalry known as the Rough Riders. So these are a group of men who are going to fight under Theodore Roosevelt. They are particularly famous for their charge at San Juan Hill. So basically, there are a couple different victories here, and we're going to look more in depth at these in class. First at Kettle Hill, which sets up the victory at San Juan Hill. So these are just two major strategic points that we are taking as part of this war here. And Theodore Roosevelt really got his name for his role in both of these. Ironically, didn't play as big of a role as he's made out to be, but because he goes on to become president, it really is kind of talked up a little bit more. However, really what becomes important in this war is the Navy. We could not have won this war without the Navy. The naval battle along the Cuban coast destroys the Spanish fleet, and that is really going to be what kind of bites the bullet for Spain. So the Navy, both in the Philippines and in the Caribbean, are going to cause this war to end relatively quickly. Like I said, the war is less than a year long. That's where it gets its nickname, the Splendid Little War, right? It's kind of romanticized in American culture at the time, and people just kind of like think of it fondly. But this is going to be the end of the war. So the treaty is an interesting treaty. First of all, I love this newspaper article that says, the peace treaty signed at last. The Spanish are very gloomy, right? This idea, like, oh, poor Spain. But we have a couple amendments that come out of this. So Cuba gains its independence from Spain, but not its independence from us. We had passed an amendment earlier in the war that granted Cuba what was called protectorate status. This was called the Teller Amendment. You might actually want to write this down. The Teller Amendment, which we had passed early, forbade us from taking Cuba as a colony. We had basically promised the Cubans that we're not going to do that, right? So at the end of the war, we can't take Cuba as a colony, but we can protect them. So the protectorate status basically implies that we're going to keep you safe. We're going to overlook your government. You get your own government, but we're going to make sure you do everything right. And, you know, we can still kind of have our own interests there, so we can still have our businessmen there and that sort of thing. But we're going to protect you. Really, when you think about it, it's a colony, right? It's basically a colony. Next, we have Puerto Rico and Guam. Also two Caribbean islands that were controlled by Spain. Both of these are given to us as colonies, as U.S. territories. And we don't use the term colony in America. That's kind of a dirty word in America. So we don't call them colonies, we call them territories. But we both take those territories as away from Spain and now make them part of the U.S. And finally we have the Philippines. So we actually buy the Philippines from Spain. We offer Spain $20 million in order to take control of the Philippines, and that's going to become, like I said, a good naval station, kind of similar to Pearl Harbor was in Hawaii. So this is the war. This wraps it up. So when you think about kind of what you saw in this war, it's a really short, really quick little conflict. But it really is America starting to get involved in the major world stage. That's really what the significance of this is. So anyway, we'll talk more specifically about some of these things in class and what really was this a valid conflict and that sort of thing. But until then, I will see you next time. Goodbye.